Hello, everyone. I'm Barry Boyce, editor-in-chief of Mindful Magazine and mindful.org. And this is the Point of View podcast. We're here today with my very good friend, Frank Ostaseski, who in 1987 co-founded Zen Hospice in San Francisco, and then in 2005 co-founded Metta Institute. And he's just come out with a book detailing his work with people who are dying. It's called The 5 Invitations, Discovering What Death Can Teach Us About Living Fully. And Frank is here today to talk about what he's learned from his work. And I'd like to start out, Frank, by asking you how you got started in this work.
You know, I think it was a long and winding road that got me here. Probably the truth is we get called to this work. You know, it's not something we choose on a high school skill set exam. My own mother died when I was quite young, about 16, and my dad a few years later. So that gave me an early relationship with death. Later, I worked in refugee camps in southern Mexico, refugees fleeing from Central America. Buddhism and its study of impermanence was an early influence for me. And then the AIDS epidemic hit in San Francisco. We had 30,000 people die of this illness, 30,000 people in the Bay Area alone. And so I kind of cut my teeth, if you will, on that, caring for people. We had no idea what we were doing. We were making it up as we went along. You know, there were no services in place in those days. And so I was one of the early responders and on the front lines of that epidemic. Yeah. So all of these were factors that sort of drew me into this work, you know. But my life has always had a stream of service through it. You know, compassionate action has always been the focal point of my life, I'd say. Yeah.
So what would you say what kept you going in this work? I mean, people who work in these difficult kind of situations where they see the kind of pain that, you know, on the surface, we feel like we couldn't handle that. I mean, in your book, you talk about a son dying of AIDS who's been rejected by his father. And can you tell us a little bit about that story? And then I want
well, you know, at Zen,
something like that and keep going.
Yeah, at Zen Hospice, first of all, we began by working with people who were living on the margins of society, people who lived on the streets. And they didn't trust very much. And so if I was going to be of any help to them, first of all, I had to be clear about my intention and real. You know, they wanted authentic relationship. So yeah, I worked with people who had nothing. You know, I changed diapers on park benches behind City Hall. But I also worked with people with enormous political power and great health insurance and, you know, intact families. But then there were people like Nguyen, a Vietnamese guy who was ghosts, and Isaiah, his roommate, who was very comforted by visits from his dead mother. And then there was this family that you spoke of, a man I'd worked with. He was a hemophiliac, and he contracted HIV through a blood transfusion. But the year before this, he had disowned his gay son, who also was diagnosed with AIDS. And now the two of them were in twin beds in a single room, being cared for by Agnes, the husband's wife, and the son's mother. And, you know, it was incredibly difficult and challenging and moving also, beautiful, you know. The thing is that even in really difficult stuff, you know, in situations like the ones I'm describing, there are moments of great beauty. There are moments of great tenderness, and where people come forward and blossom, or where compassion shows up in ways that you couldn't have imagined. And this is part of what keeps me going. But also, you know, years ago, I mentored with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And she would bring me to her workshops, and I would sit in the back of them. And in those days, the workshops were mostly people who were dying or suffering a great loss. And so she would sit me in the back of the room, and I would do this practice in the back of the room as a way of kind of, I thought, helping the room, but really it was just a way to protect myself. It was just a way for me to keep suffering at arm's length. And one night I left one of those workshops and I went down the dirt path back to my room, and I just fell down on my knees and started to cry. And I just wept, And Elizabeth came along, with a cigarette and a cup of coffee. And she leaned over to me and she said, "Oh, you were trying to carry their pain. You were trying to hold their pain. You can't do that. You have to let their pain move through you." And that was a really great teaching and understanding for me that buoyed me through the rest of my work for the last 30 years, really. We can't hold the other person's pain. We can't take it on in that way. It's not ours. We can be empathetic with it. We can compassionately respond to it. But we have to let it move through us.
So do you respect that distinction between, people say there's compassion fatigue, but what they are often saying now is that, well, really you can have empathy fatigue.
Yeah, I think that, we get tangled up in this language, but I think people get empathetically overloaded. We feel with the other person, and we feel so much that we get merged with them. And then it's like two depressed people down a well without a ladder. You can't help them very much. So you have to be able to stay in your own seat. You have to know that I'm over here and you're over there, and there's a common ground in our suffering, but it's your suffering. And so if I get lost in it, I won't be able to help you. So compassion is, some kind of stability that allows me then to use that empathy as a bridge, but then to, take skillful and wise action.
So you've already talked a bit about some things you learned early on. What would you say you've learned from this work? I'm sure you've learned a great deal, but if you had to pick a few things that come to mind this morning.
Yeah. Well, the thing that I've learned the most, I think, is that ordinary people find within themselves the resources, the strength, the compassion to meet the impossible in extraordinary ways. And that's what I've seen time and again, people who didn't think they were prepared for this, had no training for this, they respond either to their own illness or to the caring for a loved one in remarkable ways. We're talking about healthcare, reform in the United States. Most of the healthcare that's being provided in this country is being provided by people with no training at all. Their family members and friends. 45 million Americans are caring for a family member or a friend. Yeah, they've had no training whatsoever, except the wise counsel of their good hearts, and the dedication of their innate generosity and kindness.
Well, how do you think they're doing?
I think they're, struggling, like the rest of us. I think we're sort of finding our way through it, But, let's go back to the AIDS epidemic as an example. For me, it's one of the greatest spiritual movements that happened, or spiritual events that happened in the 20th century. That regular people who never would have been involved in caregiving, they were lawyers and insurance salesmen, and they were only concerned about how tight their butts were, really. It was all about attraction, and I don't mean to be, to demean that, but what I'm suggesting is that people rose up and started caring for each other in ways that they never thought they could. Support groups happened. There was no systems in place. People did this. Ordinary people like you and me created these systems. And that became a model for taking care of people in our country. It's been followed in the examples that's happened in the breast cancer movement is just a fine example. They modeled what they're doing on what happened in the HIV epidemic. So yeah, ordinary people. The other is that, that we underestimate the power of simple human presence. We're always looking for the next skill set, the thing to do. And we underestimate the power of just sitting with someone. The quiet, kind, tender being with, the holding of a hand, listening to a lifetime of stories that have been lived and are now ending. The simplicity of that.
Well, often, though, we feel quite awkward. You feel like, you want to be saying, the right thing, or bring in the right book, or read the this guidebook about death, or
Hmm.
want to be often, when my mother was dying, I would see folks would come to the room and they would want to talk a lot. What is that kind of impulse, and how do you counsel in dealing with that? I mean, you were saying, we underestimate the power of human presence, but, it's an awkward situation.
It is awkward oftentimes because, well, first of all, it's been hidden from us. And so we don't have much experience with it. And so when we come in, we're walking into a situation where, we don't know what to do. And so we rely on old habits, we get nervous. And so we start yakking away. One of the problems, I think, is that we walk into a room where someone is dying and we see them as a dying person. And I think this is actually an error. Not to see them as a person who's going through the experience of dying. It's not just semantical. We give them an identity of a dying person, and that scares us. Yeah. And so, I think to walk in the room and see the same person that we've always loved and cared for, or was our friend, and treat them, not as a dying person, but as Barry and Frank, as the people that we are, and meet them there. That's the first place to begin. People can't be dying all the time. They just have to have a regular life. And so meet them where they are. That's the first thing. And then second thing is monitor your own anxiety, and don't expect the person who's in the bed to take care of you. In other words, if you're feeling anxious, if you're feeling, nervous, sense your body a little bit. Feel your breath a little bit. Settle. Calm down, ask more questions than giving. I ask more questions than I do give answers. Yeah, I inquire. I get curious. I have a sense of wonder when I'm with someone. So rather than my feeling like I have to give them some kind of counsel, I actually want to know how they're doing, how they're meeting this experience. And what I find is that people relax in my presence because they know I'm not so afraid of what's happening for them. Yeah.
So you were talking about asking questions. This reminds me that one of your invitations is about knowledge and knowing, and not presuming that you know what's going on. Can you talk about that a bit?
Well, yeah.
You've been very helpful to me when
Yeah.
I've had friends who were dying, and give me that kind of counsel about presuming.
Well, when I walk into a room where someone is dying, I don't pretend to know what that experience is. I don't know. They know, So I have to find out from them what's actually useful. If I walk in with all my knowing, if I walk in with all my expertise, if I walk in with all my tools, I have a lot of tools, Barry. I've been at this for 3 decades. But if I place that toolbox down between me and a client, one of us is sure to trip over it. Yeah. So I don't lead with my tools. I lead with my humanity. I put my tools behind me. If I need one, I can pull them out of my back pocket. So to walk in the room with an open mind, a mind that's ready and receptive, actually, that's curious, maybe full of wonder. This is what the Buddhists speak about: beginner's mind, or don't know mind, a mind that's not so full of itself. Yeah. Ignorance is not knowing. Ignorance is misperception. Yeah. Ignorance is we know something, but it's the wrong thing. Yeah. And so that's often what's happening in a room where someone's dying. We come in with all our ideas. It's okay to say, I don't know what to say here. It's all right to say, I don't know.
Give me an example, Frank, where that, perhaps the first time that you dealt with a child who had died, or.
Yeah. Well, the first image that's just coming to mind is a friend of mine who was a social worker, and for a woman that had no family. And this woman was in a nursing home, and she was acting out one night and screaming, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. And the staff didn't know what to do, so they called the social worker. The social worker came down at 2 a.m. and came over to her bedside, and the woman was screaming, I don't know what to do. And the social worker just leaned into her and said, oh, Agnes, I don't know what to do either. And Agnes settled down. you know? She just needed someone to meet her where she was, you know, not to fix it. Yeah. Yeah, we don't, we walk into situations that we've never walked into before. I got called on the phone one day by a man, and he said, I understand that you could help keep our son at home after he dies. And I said, yes, I could do that. I could help you with that. And he said, well, could you come now? Our son has just died. Wow.
Oh my.
7 years old. So I went to their house. I never met this family before. I never met this child before. And I walked in the room, and following my intuition, I went over to the bed. I leaned over and I kissed him on the forehead. And when I did this, the whole room broke into tears. Because while everybody had cared for him with great love, nobody had touched him since he died. And so we talked, this mom and dad and I, about this ritual that we've done in all traditions for millennium, which is to bathe the body, to care for the body. And so they were great gardeners, and they got rose geraniums and sage and other herbs from their garden. And we made a sweet basin of herbs and flowers. And we began to bathe this body, this boy's body. And the mom and dad did it. And the mom washed him from the back of his head down his back. And she cared for every little scratch and nick with such loving attention, you know. And sometimes the dad couldn't do it. You know, it was too much for him. So he'd go and stand by the window and look out into the garden. It took a long time to bathe this boy. It took a few hours. And sometimes his mother would look at me with these beseeching eyes to say, will I survive this? Can any mother survive this? And my job was to hand her another washcloth and send her back to her child, to go back into the suffering, because that's where the healing's always found. It's always found in the middle of the suffering. This mom was so kind and exquisite and caring for her child. And so by the time she got to his face and washed his face, it was so intimate between them. There was no separation between them. Maybe like the moment when he was born, you know, where mother and child are one being in a way. That's how it was in this moment. It was so tender, you know, so beautiful.
Wow.
You know, I went home that night, Barry, and I held my own son very close. He was 7 years old at the time. Yeah. So one of the things that happens in this work, you were asking me what I learned, is when I see how precarious this life actually is, it helps me to appreciate how precious it is. And then I don't want to waste a moment. Then I want to tell the people I love that I love them. Yeah.
Well, there's a couple of things I want to mine there that at least around what you were saying about the healing happens when you go into the suffering, toward the suffering. And at one point, you know, you had said that, you know, that you were holding the pain at arm's length.
Yeah.
Doing loving kindness practice in your mind, it's actually a mechanism for holding it at arm's length.
Yeah.
Now it seems, you know, as you tell that story of going over there and going to right up to that child and kissing him on the head and helping to bathe the body, you know, I shudder at the thought, you know, that I have trouble imagining that I'd be able to do that. And it feels to me like we have a kind of a built-in avoidance mechanism to stay away from those things that are painful. And one can really justify that in your mind. I can't handle it. You're saying in your mind, you know, you might say that I'd like to, I feel, but I can't handle it. You know, how do you get past that? How does one get past that?
Well, you know, first of all, we should acknowledge that this is perfectly normal and natural and even helpful to our species. You know, our instinctual drives are important, you know, and they do protect us in some very important ways. So I think we don't try and override that. I don't think we try and tough it out or, you know, go in on our white horse, you know, charging in, you know. I think what we do is we get really familiar with it. We get intimate with it. we turn toward our own reactivity and mindfully, kindly, warmly say, well, what is it? What is it that's scaring me here? And here's the thing. When you're scared, Barry, don't you know you're scared?
Yeah, you definitely feel it.
Right. Beautiful. So that means that there's some part of you that's not scared. The part of you that's aware, right? The part that's aware, that's mindful of being scared is not scared. And we can train ourselves to function from that part of our being. Doesn't mean that the fear goes away. It just means that the fear is not the only thing in the room. Yeah. So we can have the fear and still function. We can have the fear and stay present. Yeah. And in fact, having the fear is important because it helps us to build an empathetic bridge to the other person because they're afraid too. Yeah. And so, if we haven't studied our fear, if we don't know something about our fear, and we walk in a room where somebody's scared and we say, I understand, they're going to smell our insincerity and our sentimentality, and we're not going to be trustworthy for them. So we have to investigate our own pain. We have to investigate our own grief and fear. So when I'm working with the dying, I'm always looking at my own grief. I'm always looking at my own fear. But I also trust and know, after many years, that it's not the only thing in the room. Yeah? It's not the only thing in the room. Now, when I say go towards suffering, I don't mean in some brutal, hard-hearted way. I mean, approach it, walk closer to it, hold hands with it, develop a handshake relationship with it. Yeah. Now, in some cases, we can't do that, and we need to acknowledge that. If we've had a lot of trauma, for example, around a particular kind of pain, we're going to become a reverberating chamber when we experience or witness that pain in somebody else. And in those situations, we have to be really, really tender with ourselves. We might need to withdraw from the situation. We might need to resource some place of safety in us so that we can develop some equilibrium that will allow us to then turn back toward this experience. So I think that, there's no hard and fast rules around these things, but generally speaking, compassion arises out of the relationship with suffering. Not much relationship with suffering, not much compassion. Yeah.
So it seems to me you're counseling not heroic grand gestures, but something like easy stages.
Yeah, I think so. I think we got to, sometimes the closest we can get to a room where someone is dying is the hallway, And that may be as far as we get that day, and we say hello to the family and we say, I'll be back on Tuesday, and that's enough. Look, in this world of mindfulness and spiritual lives, we talk a lot about compassion, but we don't talk about how sometimes we get exhausted by compassion. And when we get scared and we can't find our compassion, when I was working at the height of the AIDS epidemic, I was with 30, 40, 50 people sometimes in a week that died. And that was devastating for me. So I did three things. The first thing I did was I went back to my meditation cushion and I practiced my mindfulness. I learned to get familiar with what was hurting me. And I developed my capacity for self-awareness. The second thing I did was I got body work once a week. I went to a massage practitioner and he didn't do a whole bunch of fancy stuff on me. He'd just say to me, where should we work today? And I'd say, my shoulder, just my shoulder. And he'd just put his hand on me, and when he would, I'd start to cry. And there was something about the relationship with him and his making physical contact with me that really helped me. And I just cried, And that was important. It was a kind of important catharsis for me. And I couldn't do it alone. I needed the relationship to do it. Yeah. And then the third thing I would do is I would go to this hospital, San Francisco General, where I knew the nurses. And there I would go to the maternity ward, where there were babies who were born to mothers addicted to crack. And they would give me these babies, and I would sit in a rocking chair for about an hour before I'd go home to my own children. I would rock these babies. I just rock them back and forth, And there was something about being able to soothe the suffering in that moment and really get them to help them to come to a place of relaxation. That was very important to me because there was other kinds of suffering that I couldn't relieve. I couldn't relieve it,
You said earlier that one of the difficulties we have with death is that it's hidden from us. And of course, lots been written about that, going back to, Jessica Mitchell and The American Way of Death,
Yeah, and Ernest Becker, right? The denial of death. Yeah.
And so, one, in what way is death hidden from us? And are we, as some people say, a death-denying culture? Are we, so...
Well, I mean, I could make a case, and we could all make a case for our society being death-denying, that we're youth-oriented and youth-focused, et cetera. But it's not my experience, actually. My experience is that individuals are hungry to talk about dying. They really want to talk about it. They want to know what's the wisdom that dying has to teach us about living fully. They want to know how to care for their loved ones who are, sick. They want to know what are I'm working with a lot of 35-year-olds now, and they want to know, what do you learn there at the time of dying that I should know now in my life? So I think people are hungry to talk about this. It's just that we've made it so complex, and we've given dying over to doctors and nurses and undertakers, yeah, and in so doing, we've absented ourselves from the most important conversation of our life. Actually, I'm with people sometimes in hospitals. The tool that's most used in hospitals for measuring death is that monitor, right? The up and down graph that tracks the breathing and the heart rate.
Right.
And, I've been with family members who sit there and watch their loved ones dying on TV. They're waiting for that dreaded flat line to come, that they saw on some television show. Yeah.
Right.
Instead of becoming intimate with the person that's in the bed, the person that they love, So we've scared ourselves around dying. But my sense is that that's changing. It's changing culturally. There's many more books about it. People are there's death cafes and death over dinner and all these fantastic, venues that are emerging now. And books like mine that are out there and people are really responding to, because they want to know, what does death have to show me about life?
That even though in the main we've created a culture to insulate ourselves from death, given half a chance, most individuals, most folks are actually eager to.
Yeah, especially if they can speak to someone who's not so afraid of it. That's been my experience. When I'm with people who are dying, their relatives come in and don't want to talk to them about it. I go in the room and they're happy to talk to me about it. I always ask people, for example, what do you think is going to happen after you die? And it's a really good question to ask, because we all have some story about what happens after we die. And that story is shaping the way in which we die, and I think even the way in which we lead our lives. So I engage people in those those conversations rather, and we have fantastic explorations together.
Something I learned from you, I don't know, more than a decade ago, was about how people in the latter stages of their life who know that they're dying, or certainly can sense they're dying, they want to talk. Yeah. And, you in the hospice, you learn to allow people the room to tell their story, so to speak. It was about leaving that kind of space rather than filling it up. And so when I was visiting my mother repeatedly in the last years of her life, I took she was in a nursing home that was on the side of a mountain. So I would take her for a drive. And finally, it was a captive situation. There was no way that I could turn away and be thinking about work. And we were driving through the countryside. It was her time. And finally, we'd been doing this for a few years. She suddenly said, "Barry, what do you think happens when you die?" And it was by leaving that amount of space. And in fact, in a way, it was years of space, because I never pushed it. But I stayed there, and it was a revelation. And she didn't want a definitive answer. Yeah, we were watching clouds, moving in the sky, and she didn't want a textbook answer. She said, "I know what they taught me when I was a kid in church, but I'm not so sure I believe that." And that experience of leaving space I mean, is that a lot of what you've done over the years?
Well, first of all, I just want to say how beautiful it is. Thank you for sharing that, and how beautiful that you did that you allowed her to have, that you allowed both of yourselves to have that space. And it sounds like her question wasn't looking for an answer, but rather an invitation for you to join her in reflection, in just a quiet reverie. I'm like, I wonder what happens, It has a sense of wonder about it, And so that's a really, we would kill that wonder if we came in with some textbook answer. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting and I think because it had taken years to do it and I had some good counsel, I sensed intuitively right away that this is us exploring this territory together as if we're driving through it.
Yeah, right. She was looking right at it.
Yeah, and so she's looking at it now.
You go to a nursing home in America, or anywhere, and you find people looking out the window. And, we come over to them and say, do you want to play bingo? Or we say, remember when you used to go to Coney Island and ride the roller coasters? And what's your favorite piece of music? And we engage them in discussions of meaning or of the past. And actually, they are much more turning toward what I could call mystery, the unknowable, the land of unanswerable questions. Yeah. And in that in that territory, we are all explorers. And the best thing we can do is sit beside someone, not opposite them, but right beside them and look at it. As you two, I can imagine we're doing on a bench or sitting in your car looking out at the sky. Yeah. A beautiful image. That's an exquisite way of being with somebody. To let them find what's true for them. It doesn't matter what I think about dying. It matters what do they think.
Yeah, I think that side-by-side thing is interesting. That's part of what being in a car, ironically, forced or created, because, you're not zeroing in on somebody with some kind of expectation.
There was a woman I worked with. She was a Christian Scientist. She was 90 years old, one of the most loving people I'd ever met. And she was ready to die. She just described it as, I just want to lay my head in the lap of Jesus. That's how she put it. And it was beautiful and no fear. And then her granddaughter came to see her. And her granddaughter was very well-meaning and wonderful. And she said, Grandma, I read a book. And the book said that you don't have to worry when you die, because everybody who has ever died before you will be there to meet you, and they'll embrace you in their arms. And Grandma got terrified. Grandma got really scared, because what was true for Grandma that she hadn't told anyone, but she told me, was that her husband, Edgar, had been beating her for the last 10 years of their marriage, and he had died 5 years before. And now she was scared, really scared to spend eternity with him. So I don't try to impose my ideas on other people. I explore with them. I find out what is it that matters to them. What's their story about it? And how does that story comfort them or scare them?
So we've been talking about death as final physical death, but it seems there are all kinds of deaths all the time, in a way that's what you've learned and are learning to embrace, and what you're asking us to embrace. I think, for example, of how much fear we have of getting a diagnosis that it might not be the end of our life, but let's say we got diagnosed with serious debilitating disease that's going to change our life, or one of our children that's diagnosed with that. So we kind of have a consciousness of the ideal life is lived in a protective bubble. And so often I think this about my children and my grandchildren, that even though I know that the great power of human life is resilience, and that it's necessary, life is practically requires vicissitudes. Nevertheless, there's this kind of a fantasy dream of no pain, and somebody asks us, how are things going? And we talk about all the wonderful things that are happening. And, everything's tallying up great. That's a pretty deep-seated habit that television commercials and, there's so much reinforcement for that protective bubble. How does one begin to wear down that habit a bit and come to understand in not just a cognitive way, but leaning toward the pain that exists in life is the most valuable way to be?
Yeah. Well, as you say, I don't think we can just persuade ourselves of this, cognitively, because it doesn't make any sense to us. It feels counterintuitive, actually. But, I talk about this way. I say life and death are a package deal. You can't pull them apart, And so when we face that reality, when we know that that's so, then we know that death isn't something waiting for us at the end of a long road, but it's in the marrow of every moment, right? Mostly we imagine death will come later, and later gives us this comfortable illusion of a safe distance from death, But constant change, impermanence, as they speak about in Buddhism, it's not later. It's right now. It changes the norm. So one of the things that reflection on death can do is show us something about constant change, that everything is coming and going, I used to be blonde, It's not there anymore, Gravity's having its way with my body, There's constant change. And so when I recognize that that's the nature of life, all life, then I relax a little bit, I don't hold things so tightly. I don't take myself so seriously. I don't hold my ideas so permanently, And I recognize that we're all in the boat together, and it engenders a certain kind of kindness for one another, So I think to live in harmony with what's true brings us great relief, actually. And what's true is constant change. Not just death at some later junction, constant change all the time. We like to think of ourselves as a solid thing moving through a changing world. We say seasons come and go, relationships come and go. But, I'm the one thing that doesn't come and go, right? Frank, my solid sense of self, right? But even that's subject to constant change. So this is one of the things that we discover in the time of dying, that all the ways we've defined ourselves, all the ways, the roles that we've carried, all of those are either stripped away by illness or gracefully given up. And then we have to find something much more essential about who we are. And that's both the challenge and the great beauty of the dying process.
You were saying that, we can't convince ourselves to embrace pain, that it's not just a exercise of cognitively persuading ourselves. So you're more than a bit of a leader in terms of encouraging these kinds of approaches and attitudes in caregiving. You've given talks all over the country, in the world, in fact, trainings, the Metta Institute. And now you have a book. So,
well, watch out. I could be an expert here. That's dangerous.
You'd be a thought leader.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. So, look, Barry, it's so,
approach other than trying to persuade people in that, to present arguments. Because often you present an argument and that's how people shut down. And so how are you?
Well, I think, as you've seen in our conversation here, that I tend to be a storyteller. And I think the stories are wonderful because people can enter them wherever they need to and leave them wherever they want to. And they can pull from the story whatever they find most valuable. When I was a little boy, 5 years old, I was playing with a pocket knife, and as little boys will do. and I cut my finger really bad, cut my hand really bad. And I came into the house bleeding, and called for my mother. And my mother came and did a great thing. She embraced me. First of all, she held me. And she held me close on her lap. And then she said, we need the magic towel. We need the magic towel. So I said, well, okay. I was scared. So she pulls this towel off the kitchen stove and wraps it around my hand, And this was a beautiful thing. It was really a way of showing how we could go toward our pain and hold it kindly and lovingly, And that was beautiful. And that, in a way, that is enough. But she did something more spectacular. At one point, she said, should we unwrap the towel and look at the pain, look at the wound? Yeah. And so she slowly unwrapped the towel and we looked into the wound. And I could see that I was okay. That I could look into a wound and I would be okay. Yeah. That the wound wouldn't have to define me. It wouldn't be all that I am. Yeah. Now that was a 5-year-old boy learning that lesson. Yeah. But I think that we can do that in other ways in our life. When we look at our pain, let's just say it's, we got a bad sore back, or we've got a knee that's bugging us. When we look at it, really look at it closely, carefully. First of all, we see it's not one big solid thing, right? It's moment-to-moment experiences, a moment of heat, a moment of tingling, a moment of pressure. We can explore it and see that it's not one big mass of pain. Yeah, and then we begin to look at it and we start to see, the way I'm relating to it matters. Right? When I'm scared of it and trying to keep it at arm's length, the pain, the resistance seems to make the pain worse. So I begin to study my relationship with pain. I begin to understand something about it. And I do that with the small pains of my life. You can't start doing it on your deathbed. It's too late in the game. So you have to practice now. And I think that a warm, loving attention toward our pain, not with the intention to get it to go away, but to get to know it. Become intimate.
What do you say about mindfulness, Frank? And mindfulness has become a very widely used word and has come to mean a lot of things. And we're picky about how it's used, as long as it's bringing benefit to somebody in some way.
Yeah.
But sometimes mindfulness is thought of as almost like a nanny state of the mind. Where you're trying to keep things together and pay close attention. You seem to be describing something that has to do with, like as you were saying, looking into the wound. It has a kind of an intimacy about it, or a warm. It's automatically has some warmth in it. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, there are all these words out there, that are bantered about in the spiritual circles: enlightenment and awakening and realization and things like this. And they're all fine, but they all feel a little far away to me. They all feel a little distant and like something I have to achieve. So when I describe myself, when I describe my practice, I don't even describe it as mindfulness. I just describe it as intimacy. It's a way of me becoming intimate with myself and the world, to become familiar. To come to know it in an intimate way where there's not so much distance between me and the thing that's in front of me. There was a guy that we worked with, his name was Carl. He was kind of a grandfather figure for me, beautiful man. And he had stomach cancer and he had a morphine pump to manage his pain, but he wanted to use meditation to manage his pain. Now, meditation is great, but it doesn't necessarily take away stomach pain. So I said, okay, well, he said, could you teach me? And I said, sure. So I did kind of what we were talking about a moment ago. I brought his attention to the experience of the pain, to the minute sensations of the pain. But it was too much for him. It just blew him out. He just screamed, oh, it's too much, hurts too much. So I said, okay. I said, let's try something else. I said, let me just put my hands on you. So I put my hands on his belly. Now, this was totally intuitive, Barry. And I said, how's that? And he said, oh, it still hurts. So I pulled my hands away a little further, made a little bit more space. How's that? Oh, it still hurts. So I pulled my hands very far away. I said, how's that? And he said, oh, that's lovely. That's lovely. And I said, oh, could you rest there for a minute? And then out of his mouth, not mine, he said, rest in love. Rest in love. Yeah. Now, from then on, whenever he got into pain, he'd push his morphine pump and then repeat to himself, rest in love, rest in love. Yeah. I didn't do any California woo stuff. There was no special energy work being done here. I didn't do any healer stuff. We just made space for the pain. And whatever we give space to can move. Yeah, whatever we give space to can move. And that includes the physical sensations of pain. So, whenever this guy when his wife would come over and she was a little nervous, he just leaned, put his hand through the bed rail and put his hand on her knee and say, "Oh, darling, rest in love, rest in love." So that's a way we could talk about bringing the heart into mindfulness. Yeah. To really bring the natural compassion of our good hearts into relationship with whatever it is that's difficult for us. It's not enough just to be interested in the sensations or interested in the state of mind. That's not enough. We need love too. Yeah. I mean, if we're going to go to a mountain lake that we love, it's great that we love the lake and we need that love to go to the lake. That's the fuel for the journey. But it's not enough to love the lake. You got to love the walk up the mountain. Yeah. Otherwise, when the mosquitoes come out, you'll run away, right? You'll turn back. So mindfulness practice is not about achieving some particular state, some enlightened state. It's about becoming intimate all along the way. And that is an action of not just interest, but of love.
You were saying that that's beautiful, by the way, of course. And you were saying that, whatever we give space to can move.
Yeah.
But I think you also point out that within space, you find stillness that you don't necessarily have to try to manufacture in the way like, I want to calm myself down.
Yeah.
Within that space, there's actually a stillness there already, no?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the misunderstandings about mindfulness, that we use it just to calm the body, Look, if the only thing that was necessary in our life was to have a calm body, we could take, morphine. It would calm us down right away, I don't think that's the intention of this life. I think this life is to grow in wisdom. So we need some stability to look. And so watching the breath, sensing the body, those are things that we can do to stabilize. But then we have to turn toward the experience and really get engaged, really get engaged. And with the intention of learning, yeah, not with the intention of getting something to go away, not appropriating the mindfulness to do the work of a personality that wants so badly to establish, stability, non-change, or constancy. Yeah. So yeah, use the mind to learn. Use the mind to learn.
You've talked about a lot about what we can do personally. As one last question, I'd like to ask you to talk about the bigger picture of healthcare in America and in the world. What are one or two things, or ways or means that the kind of approaches you're talking about could come into healthcare?
Oh gosh, there's so much we could say about this, Barry, but look, the great fear that emerges for everybody, even when they have, a temporary illness, is the fear that it will get worse, right? And if it gets worse, well, then it could end in dying. So I think that the reflection on dying is, first of all, very life-affirming. It helps us to see what matters most to us. And also, as we confront our relationship to death and we become more familiar with it, when we sit down with it and have a cup of tea, get to know it really well, we can start incorporating the lessons that it has to offer us. And I think that's important in healthcare. We're still seeing death as failure. In healthcare, we're still imagining that death is the problem to be avoided at all costs. And so the only thing we think about it is, how do we make the best of a bad situation? And when we do that, we devalue the dying process, and we devalue the person who's going through the dying process. So that's the first thing. The second is that, I do something really simple when I'm teaching docs and nurses. I teach them how to breathe with somebody else. Really simple. They breathe in, patient breathes in, you breathe in with them. Patient breathes out, you breathe out with them. Very simple activity. And what it establishes is a kind of intimacy between the two. When I do that with docs and nurses for just 2 minutes, they feel, and entirely different experience in the relationship. And I thought, wow, if we want to reform healthcare, wouldn't this be a remarkable thing to do? I mean, suppose that when we went into a patient's room, we actually were with them. When we felt their pulse for 30 seconds, we actually were with them, and we weren't looking at our watch or out the window or about the next patient we were going to see. So bringing presence, quality of presence into healthcare, I think is essential. And it's one of the things that I've been working on for the last 30 years is teaching docs and nurses, therapists, social workers, chaplains, how to stay present, how to stay in the room when the going gets rough. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Frank. Thank you for doing that work and may that expand. I think obviously it could make a very big difference. So it's been such a pleasure, as always, to talk with you, and I hope lots of people can pick up your book.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
They'll learn a lot.
Yeah, I want to emphasize that the book is not about taking care of the dying. It's really about what do you learn there that can help you live a life that's meaningful and full, and that's why I wrote it, because it's too late at the time of dying. I mean, to imagine at the time of dying that we will have the physical strength, the emotional stability, the mental clarity to do the work of a lifetime is a ridiculous gamble.